Good afternoon,
This
everybody.
track is sponsored by CommScope. Maximize your entire network from the head end to the home with end-to-end solutions from CommScope.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Cable Tech Expo 2020. First day, you are in the right place if you are looking for fixed wireless access. And in fact, this is going to be such a great hour that I suggest you text all of your friends to join you. Now today we have two good presenters. The first, Frank Real of Zona Partners. The second, Somi Alapati of Ericsson. Both will be discussing fixed wireless access and how it can help enable parts of your network to get gigabit speed to the home. And so with that, I'd like to kick off with Frank. Excuse me. Before I kick it over to Frank, I would like to say the questions will be taken during the session, but not be answered until the end of the session, where I will moderate them, or the end of the presentation where I'll moderate them. So please feel free during the session, if you have questions, to put your questions in the Q&A queue. Thank you, Frank.
All right, thanks, Morgan, and hello, everyone. Nice to be with you here this afternoon. So the topic of my presentation is about comparing fixed wireless access to fiber to the home, essentially. So we'll look at both the performance aspects and also the financial aspects. And just to give you a context about the work that I would like to present today, it's really a joint collaboration between us at Zona Partners and Duke Tech Solutions, Sudhir and Luke at Duke Tech. Both of us are advisory services. Actually, we come more from the wireless side, and Duke Tech come at it more from the fiber side. So we put this together as part of our work in the ecosystem with service providers and also with private equity investors and so forth. So to go into an outline of the presentation, I would like to focus first on the millimeter wave propagation and the impairments, and then to look at the different aspects of performance and look at the deployment scenario and cost that out and compare it to fiber. And then I would like to talk a little bit about rural areas and then to have some conclusion and observations. So with that, to start off here, I usually like to talk about the impairments in the wireless channel and how that affects the signals, because this really determines ultimately the performance and the business case. So when it comes to millimeter wave, and in my talk, when I say millimeter wave, we're really focusing on the 28 gigahertz spectrum. What we see is that, first of all, in terms of material penetration, it's really hard to penetrate through concrete, through infrared reflective glass, and there are a lot of losses. So really from an outdoor to indoor type propagation characteristics, it's virtually nil. It's not very good for that. That means more of outdoor type CPE deployments or somewhere where there's a glass that you can have some penetration, but not completely attenuate the signal. We have some numbers here that I present. I will not go into details necessarily on some of these numbers, but 31 dB, which is quite high for penetrations through glass. The other key factor is foliage, and as a rule of thumb, is 17 dB for 10 meters, and that depends on the type of foliage. This is about 8 dB higher than 3.5 gigahertz, and I will talk about 3.5 gigahertz later on in the rural case. Rain phase and atmospheric absorption, it's not really that high for millimeter wave or 28 gigahertz propagation fixed wireless access, only because of the short distance. And the final point is about the propagation impairments. This is really critical for vendors who go about to designing their systems and consider the trade-offs between MIMO and beamforming. For example, millimeter wave is very susceptible to scattering, and typically what happens is that MIMO work better in a highly scattering environment, whereas beamforming works better more where you have signals coming through a narrow angular spread, so you can isolate the interference and the desired signal. So there are these kind of trade-offs that basically get into play. So taking all these things, I would like to talk a little bit about what kind of distances and performance in terms of throughput. We have a link budget that we present. Basically, it's in the appendix, so it's not presented here. I'll just go over the highlights, rather than go through the detailed numbers. But about 141 dB, assuming best of breed systems, meaning we assumed or taken the best performance parameters of the systems that are available today on the market, and combined these best parameters in terms of output power, in terms of receiver sensitivity. And with 141 dB, you're basically looking at about 400 meters in terms of distance for a 5-meter high CPE, and that's basically the yellow curve here related to on this graphic on the left-hand side. If you account for foliage, so this does not account for any penetration losses, but foliage, for example, of 17 dB, that will cut the distance by half to about 200 meters. So that's the kind of range that we're talking about for 28 gigahertz signals. In terms of throughput, the throughput is actually quite high for a peak. It's about 1.5 gigabit per second, and that's for one MIMO layer. If it's 2 MIMO layers, then we're looking at double that. So basically closing in on 3 gigabit per second, and on average for about 1650 megabit per second for 2 MIMO layers. So 2 MIMO layers, basically what the standard, more or less standard equipment that are being deployed today. So that basically gives you a feel for the type of throughput and the type of range. What I would like to do next is that to talk about the different technologies that we have addressed. In this paper, we look at XGS-PON. It's not a new technology. You see here 10G-PON, that's basically about 10-year-old technology. If you compare it fiber over wireless, we're saying there's about approximately 100 times more capacity in the fiber, than there is in the wireless. But the key point here is that all these technologies have a roadmap, and they continually increase throughput and performance. So that's an evolving pattern. But in general, there's 100 times difference in terms of capacity. In this paper, again, I will focus on the XGS-PON and the millimeter wave and compare the two from a financial perspective. So in terms of the fixed wireless access, in this analysis, we looked at 400 megahertz signals for signal bandwidth. There are systems now that can be deployed 600 and even 800. But our focus in this analysis was more on the 400. 64 QAM uplink, 16 downlink. You can see the peak throughput here, about 2.8 gigabit per second, and for downlink, and 0.34 gigabit per second for uplink. And for our deployment scenario of 200 users, and I will go into that in the next slide, but for 200 users in a suburban area, with oversubscription of 20, which is typical for fixed wireless access, that will result in an average sellable bandwidth of 142 megabit per second down, 23 megabit per second up for a single subscriber. And again, the distance is 400 meters. So if we compare that to the XGS-PON, which has a 10 gigabit per second symmetric capacity with an oversubscription of 20 and 32 users, subscribers per PON, we're looking about 5.6 gigabit per second up and 5.6 gigabit per second down, and the range can be 20 kilometers. So that basically gives you an idea about the performance of the two. In the next step, I would like to talk about the deployment scenario because that will impact the financial analysis. So what we've done is we looked at the North American suburban area. We estimate in this area to be around 600 houses, and that's basically your total addressable market. We assume the North American cost structure, and the business case really depends on how the operators go about building the infrastructure. We did assume a greenfield here, but we assumed also that the infrastructure will be leased. So it's not owned, it is leased, and that actually impact. And what we present is actually one scenario, but there are many different scenarios in terms of how the service providers can go about building the network that will impact, obviously, the outcome. So with that, on this kind of scenario, if we look at the fiber plant, we did take a 16-PON port OLT and 1-to-32 split per PON. This is an outdoor deployment. Basically, it's a hardened outside plant. And in terms of going back to the wireless, then there are some metrics which I mentioned earlier: 25-meter towers and 5-meter CPEs for user customer premise equipment. Moving to the next slide, the results of the financial analysis. I would like just to focus a little bit on the graphic on the upper right-hand side. Basically, what that shows, and just to look at the red line here, that is the cost per covered house, and it starts actually very low. On the x-axis, you have the cell radius, so you have from 100 meters to 500 meters, and we're sitting at around 400 meters. So with 400 meters, we're getting total cost of ownership amortized per subscriber basis around $600. So that's really the key metric in terms of the cost for the millimeter wave deployment. Now, of course, you can see that the smaller the radius, that means the less subscribers that I have and the smaller coverage area, that cost will increase, and it can increase significantly. So it's very important in fixed wireless access to have a very long range, and that's a critical point. So you can see here in the blue line, that is the increase in terms of the number of houses or subscribers as that range increases. So we did make some assumptions here to get at these numbers in terms of the financial analysis, in terms of the break even. And just to go over some of them very briefly, it's 50% market penetration. So even though it's 600 subscribers per cell, we only used 50% of those that we can acquire, 50% market penetration. So that's 300. Again, I wanted to mention that, I think I didn't mention that on the previous slide, we did use a 3-sectored sites. And here we used also 50% self-install CPE. So 50% the operator would have to install and send the truck roll. If we look at that model with the leased infrastructure, we find that the break even in this case is about 22 months. Now, there are some things that we did not consider. For example, the cost of spectrum, and we have that in the appendix because that's very important, but we chose not to include it in this analysis because it can skew the results. And the other part is the cost of the OSS, BSS, and core network, which again, we did not factor. So this comparison is purely based on the radio access and on the access side on the fiber. Bottom line, what one can say is that the model is highly susceptible to the range, and that will determine the market size or the total customers that one can obtain, and also in terms of the cell loading. So how many customers I can obtain. So that these are very, very critical parameters for any operator that's considering fixed wireless access. All right. So if I move to the next slide. Talking a little bit here about the fiber side of the financial model. What we show here on top is the breakdown, and that's the fixed, the capex side of the analysis. You can see, in terms of the cost per household passed, it's around $447. And when you add on that the drop and install, the total number will be 846. So this accounts for the fiber side CapEx expenditure. In terms of the in the OpEx, we basically took it as $53 per home passed, and that's based on some average industry numbers. And we had also some other assumptions, for example, 100 feet drop and 50% take rate. What we see here in terms of the fiber side, that the business case actually will break even in about 12 months. One value that I think is important is the revenue per subscriber. In both cases, we took $75, and that's typically, like sort of common. On the wireless side, we've seen prices anywhere from 50 to 90, but we chose to go with 75. In the back of the presentation, we do have some sensitivity analysis on these numbers. And we also have different scenarios that we present, but I will not go over them, but we can address those later on in the Q&A. Other assumptions in this, just to caveat it, that all homes are connected due to franchise agreement, and then that leasing of the equipment is not considered in this case of the fiber, and there is trend sharing also that is not considered in this analysis. Now. Sorry, just to go back one slide here. In terms of, to sum it up and to characterize what we see in terms of millimeter wave fixed and compare it to fiber, there are pros and cons for either technology. What is the pro for the millimeter wave fixed wireless access is that it's quick to deploy, and also it can be deployed in a way tactically for certain markets. So you don't have to actually do blanket coverage, but you can actually deploy it in certain neighborhoods where the business case and the market conditions are viable. And that's one key aspect of it. On the other hand, it can be quite susceptible to the propagation characteristics, to the foliage, and other parameters that will impact range. So that's the critical part about the fixed wireless access. It's quick to deploy, but there are some performance issues that somebody has to be cognizant of. In terms of the fiber, on the other hand, that it can be deployed practically in any terrain, but it does require advanced planning and permitting, and it is higher capex on the front end, but the OpEx is low. In this kind of model for fixed wireless access, it was more of a heavier OpEx model because we assumed leased infrastructure. So in this particular scenario, it comes better. The fiber comes better, of course, much better in terms of the OpEx than fixed wireless access. In terms of the quality of experience, fixed wireless access really depends on the scenario, and that's where fiber comes in, being constant and predictable. So really, in fixed wireless access depends on the distance from the cell and many other parameters. In terms of the financial structure, in this particular scenario, fixed wireless access comes longer. It comes to 22 months, but it is fairly robust business case. They're still viable, and it can be viable in many different market conditions. Obviously, fiber will give you better performance and more steady and reliable performance, and lower business case in most other cases. Next slide, I would like to talk a little bit about rural areas. Rural areas, the problem with them is that they're low density. So now it becomes harder to amortize the infrastructure costs over a few number of subscribers. And that's where we believe in terms of millimeter wave, it can struggle. And we believe that 3.5 gigahertz actually can be a better solution in this case. The spectrum cost for 3.5 gigahertz is a little bit more expensive. Actually, it can be 10 times or more, actually more expensive than millimeter wave, but in terms of range and performance, that will play better. And with the new technologies like 64TR massive Mimo, you can reach gigabit per second throughput. So that's in terms of the rural areas where we believe that the 3.5 gigahertz would play a better role, than millimeter wave. And that's something that we look forward to characterize in the future in details, in numbers like we did here with millimeter wave. So finally, just to wrap up, for fixed wireless access, it's a quick to deploy and it can be deployed selectively in certain markets. On the other hand, the fiber to the home will provide more assured reliability and better performance in terms of throughput. The CapEx and OpEx are really scenario dependent. In this scenario, the CapEx for fiber is high, but the OpEx for millimeter wave is higher than fiber. So there is a trade-off here. And finally, I think I can't stress enough that there are so many different models to look at in either case, and especially in the fixed wireless access, that one really has to look at it market by market and how one can approach to design and build the infrastructure and the business model that they select in order to go about that deployment. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and back to you, Morgan.
Thank you, Frank. If there are questions, again, you can go to www.slido.com and use the event code #SCTE-WLESS02. So if there are questions that you think about for this, there are none that have come in so far, please submit them and I'll read them either now or after the next presentation. I did have one question for you, Frank. You showed earlier that the uplink for millimeter wave was significantly below that of cable or of fiber. Is there anything that's going to be done about that? And do you see that as a limitation to the network?
So the uplink is actually, there are two aspects for it, right? One, first of all, this is TDD technology and it's configurable frame. So there are in 5G, for example, ways in which you can configure the frame to get much more uplink than you can do downlink that you can use, for example, for video surveillance. So these options are available and the standard does support those kind of options.
I think that gives you a fairly big downlink penalty, though, when you do that, when you switch a bunch of frames. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you do lose downlink, but you give it more to the uplink. For fixed wireless access, given that most traffic, as usually is done, right, is in the downlink. So in this case, we biased it with 11 slots in the downlink and 2 slots in the uplink. So that's basically the trade-off. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so please, if you have other questions on this presentation, put it into to Slido, and I'll continue to monitor it. But with that, I'd like to go on to the next presentation, if we could change that around. Somi, take it away.
Thank you, Morgan. Good afternoon, all. Happy to be talking to you all. So we'll talk about the path to gigabit fixed wireless access. So as you know, fixed wireless access is by no means a new phenomenon. The promise of ubiquitous fixed wireless access existed in every generation, and LTE Advanced and also 5G, these are no exceptions. Many who have had not so successful deployments of fixed wireless access using WiMAX or maybe some other older technologies may ask themselves, so why now? What is different this time? So there are 4 factors which are different this time. The first factor is the free or almost free spectrum. An example spectrum is CBRS spectrum, and this spectrum is also low enough in frequency wherein it propagates well, and it is also high enough in frequency where you can do beamforming. And then there is also other millimeter wave spectrum which could be of interest to you, which is the 37 gig spectrum, which is again shared spectrum. It goes from 37.0 to 37.6, and that availability is somewhere in the 2022 timeframe. So the second factor that you need to think about is the advancements in technology. So the biggest advancement in 5G is really beamforming. And we also brought that beamforming into LTE as well. So with beamforming, You can focus your energy to individual devices. You can get a better signal to noise ratio, and you can get a better performance and better reach. So beamforming is one way to improve your efficiency. Then the third factor is the formation of the global ecosystem driving the economies of scale. So the CPE price, as you know, is a very big factor in the overall business case, and hence it is very important to have global economies of scale. And then last but not the least is the government investment. So there are all these government subsidies and programs like CAF2 and also the upcoming RDOF, where government itself is involved in stimulating broadband. So these are the four factors where we believe are making the biggest contributions to fixed wireless access. So if you have access to CBRS spectrum with the availability of 40 to 60 megahertz of channels that you might get in these rural areas, you can definitely achieve speeds in the range of 100 Mbps. But with millimeter wave, you can, when you combine millimeter wave with CBRS, then we can then provide a service of gigabit per second. I'll talk about that technology as we progress in the slides. So in terms of what are the different operator challenges that are faced by the MSOs and the operators in these rural areas. So there are increasing competitive pressure to offer gigabit services. The fiber deployment cost is very high, as you know, in these rural/semi-rural areas. There is a high churn rate because of the long upgrade cycles. And they're also looking for generating new revenues from different applications. Now, how does wireless help? I mean, so you definitely believe that with the LTE Advanced and 5G technologies, we can definitely get to fiber-like speeds. Fixed wireless access reduces the cost per home passed in many, many markets. We have done a lot of business cases around that. And then fixed wireless access can get you shorter upgrade cycles. So this also enables other out-of-service offerings. So for example, once you have a CBRS network, you can also provide IoT type of applications. So in summary, there are multiple stakeholders who are driving the need for fixed wireless access. And so definitely we are not saying fixed wireless access is an alternate to fiber. I mean, if you are able to do fiber economically cheap and you can make your business case work, definitely deploy fiber. But there could be opportunities for cable plant extensions where you might want to think about fixed wireless access. Now, in terms of the, sorry, I think I should go back one slide. So this is the US fixed access line forecast. So based on multiple analyst reports, fixed wireless access is projected to have the highest growth technology for broadband services. This will be primarily driven by DSL replacements, upgrades, CAF2, RDOF, fiber extensions. I mean, those are the type of use cases. And you can see fiber fixed wireless access has around 37.4 CAGR growth that we are projecting. Now, in terms of the markets themselves, so US can be divided into 6 different morphologies. You can see on the left side, it's a downtown type of scenario. On the right side, it is a deep rural type of scenario. And you can see the home densities there. So if you have home densities in the greater than 600 range or in the less than 10 homes per square mile range, square kilometer range, then I think it's very hard for us to make a fixed wireless access business case work. But where we believe fixed wireless access business case can work is really these dense urban, suburban, rural type of scenarios. And you can see the home densities there. And in those scenarios, you also can make millimeter wave and CBRS combined for gigabit fixed wireless access, where if you have home densities of 400 to 500 homes per square mile, where that business case works. Okay. Now, in terms of what are the operators doing, various operators in the US, both wireless and wireline operators here are shown in this chart. So if you look at Verizon is using 28 gig spectrum, 39 gig spectrum, and also the band 2 and also AWS spectrum for fixed wireless access. And their focus is for the millimeter wave gigabit speeds or 300 megabits to gigabit speeds. So their focus has been on the dense urban and the urban areas. And they recently also started offering fixed wireless access in other areas, but using existing spectrum. So like in suburban, rural type of areas. So that's the latest announcement. In the middle, you see T-Mobile, Sprint, and US Cellular. Their focus is suburban, rural. As you know, the merger of T-Mobile, Sprint, that merger required offering 100 Mbps for 90% of rural population by that T-Mobile, Sprint merger. So again, it's a rural play in that type of scenario. And US Cellular, as you know, is also focused in the rural areas. Then on the right side, this has been the most recent since CBRS spectrum came along. So AT&T, of course, has been doing fixed wireless access using WCS spectrum for quite some time now. But you also have the wireline players like CenturyLink, Windstream, and also Frontier deploying fixed wireless access using CBRS spectrum. And of course, for cable companies, the opportunity to deploy fixed wireless access is for cable plant extension. So how do you extend your optical reach, optical ring reach? So that's the use case that the cable companies are definitely thinking. Okay, I'll skip over this slide. So we do have a network in Australia called NBN. It's a government-owned subsidiary. There are around 250,000 homes that are connected. Already, there are 587,000 homes passed, and it has been in service since 2011, 2012 timeframe. And they offer almost 25/5, 50/20, and 100/10 type of service. And it's a very successful network. Ericsson provides access core and end-to-end services, managed services to manage this network. And one other point I would like to bring up is, they used 2.3 gigahertz band 40 and also 3.5 gigahertz band 42 TDD network to deploy this network. Okay. Now, in terms of the business case models, so there are two models that are shown in this chart. So the first one is the consumer deploy model, wherein the consumer brings a CPE, deploys it inside the house, and the one at the top is the outdoor CPE deployment model, where you have a directional antenna deployed on the rooftop of the house. So in the indoor CPE model, this becomes a challenge wherein the operator will not have control over the resources. So you have to worry about the building penetration losses, etc. So in this case, you will not be able to get better signals. Whereas in the outdoor CP case, you are definitely above the clutter, you get a better signal to noise ratio, and you can offer SLAs for this type of service. On the indoor CP side, there is also one other issue wherein you also have, lose resources by serving those users. So you have to allocate more resource blocks, more physical resource blocks to support those type of users. So there is a ongoing OpEx for this type of deployment. So outdoor CPE definitely provides a better business case compared to indoor CPEs. Okay. Then you can see the devices also advanced. So from 2015, so if you look at the device progression here, so we used to have devices which only would do 150 Mbps, and now we are talking all the way in, for millimeter wave and also CBRS type of devices. We are talking about something like 2000 megabit per second, so up to 2 gig type of support is what we are talking about. And also the CPE's price, as I said, that is one of the biggest contributor for the overall fixed wireless access business case. And the CPE price, especially on CBRS, is now in the $150 to $250 today. And the millimeter wave plus CBRS devices, so those are getting developed. So we'll see how those price points pan out. But the important point I also want to make is we have seen these devices come down in cost as the global economies of scale have panned out in the 3.5 spectrum, especially CBRS being a band that straddles both band 42 and band 43, which are global 3.5 bands. So in those scenarios, we have seen the CPE prices have gone down significantly from where it used to be. Okay, skip over that slide. So we'll talk about the different types of spectrum. So as you know, 2.5 spectrum, there is a lot of spectrum, 200 megahertz of licensed spectrum. It has the best propagation amongst TDD spectrum. But as you know, the T-Mobile Sprint merger, so most of that spectrum is already owned by them. So, but there is still some of that spectrum available, which will also go up for auction. The cost of acquiring that spectrum is definitely much high, so that's a challenge. 3.5 spectrum, so we have 150 megahertz of that spectrum. Global ecosystem, good balance between propagation, power, and reuse. And there is also interference management via spectrum access system, so SAS. So, and it has been available since end of 2019. So a lot of operators have already taken advantage of that spectrum and deploying fixed wireless access networks. There is also C-band, but C-band, as you know, the cost of acquiring C-band will be pretty significant. Again, the advantage of that will be you have a lot of spectrum. It will have better propagation and power compared to CBRS, but the availability is, so the auction will happen this year. And the first phase of that spectrum can be deployed in December of 2021, and the second phase will be December of 2023. And then you also have the 5 gigahertz spectrum and also the upper 6 gigahertz spectrum as well. So which will also become available somewhere in the 2022 timeframe. So there is a lot of spectrum in this unlicensed spectrum. But the challenge with 5 gigahertz spectrum is that today it is only limited to 36 dBm ERP, so the propagation is very limited. Then you have the millimeter wave spectrum, which is in the 24 to 39 gigahertz. So lots of channel bandwidth is available. So you'll get access to 100 megahertz chunks, and somewhere in the 400 to 800 is definitely a possibility, 400 megahertz to 800 megahertz of spectrum. The challenge is the propagation, but we'll talk about how to improve that by combining millimeter wave with CBRS. Okay, so summary of this slide is 3.5 gigahertz is the most viable spectrum for fixed wireless access, but if you combine millimeter wave plus CBRS, you can get those gigabit type of speeds. Okay, so now in terms of how do you increase the network throughput? So the most important thing is the tonnage. So how do you improve your overall system capacity? So one way to do that is to add more cells, and you can do that by adding more cells in the mid band or in the high band, so that you can pack more cells because it doesn't have that much of a propagation. So that's one way to improve your system capacity. Then the second way is you can do carrier aggregation with available spectrum. So this is like channel bonding, if you're familiar with microwave. And the third technique is also do massive MIMO, multi-user MIMO, and those type of techniques will also get you higher system capacity. So those are the three ways in which I can improve my overall system capacity. Now, in terms of how does the massive MIMO technology work? So if you look at the picture on the top, I mean, that is how traditional cell sites, they project radio waves in a very fixed, predetermined pattern. So think of it like a floodlight. Whereas at the bottom, you have a massive MIMO antenna wherein you have these focused beams. And in this case, what you're doing is, again, focusing narrower beams to individual users, increasing their SNR, reducing interference, and getting better performance. So this is, you can think of it as a flashlight type of beams here. Here it's a floodlight. So now in terms of what we can do to improve system capacity here is where we can do multi-user MIMO. So if here in the top portion, you can imagine this being like all the resources. Let's say you have a 20 megahertz channel, you have 100 PRBs in those 20 megahertz channels. So all those PRBs will be shared by all those users. So some user might get 20, some user might get 10, depending on where the user is located, how his channel conditions are, etc. But the overall resources are shared by all the users. So it will be a division of those PRBs. Whereas if you have multi-user MIMO, you can use the same frequency and time domain resources, same PRBs for all the users, provided you can pair those UEs, and then you are able to then get a multiplier of capacity. So with single user MIMO, or with products which only are able to do one single type of sector versus multi-user MIMO, wherein I can share all the resources at the same time to all the users at the same time. So you'll get this multiplier in capacity with multi-user MIMO. Okay. Now, in terms of what we have measured and also deployed, so these are the type of scenarios that we are seeing today. So with a 44R type of system versus a 6040, 64R. So 44R, it's a 4 transmit, 4 receive radio. 64 transmit, 64 receive radio is on the right side. So in line of sight conditions, we should be able to get to 7 miles type of distance with a 44R. With a 6040, 64R, you can get up to 9 miles type of distance to get to that 100 Mbps type of service. So again, this has been with 3 times 20 megahertz. You can see these distances panning out even with if you have line of sight conditions. You can see better reach to get to that 100 Mbps type of service with beamforming. I'll show you some other results, but in realistically, I mean, this is the type of deployments that we are seeing, and of course, it all depends on terrain and clutter and all those other conditions. But in a line of sight, this is very, very possible. Okay. Now, here is a way wherein we can combine high band with mid band. So if you look at a pure high band coverage, so this is the type of coverage that you will get. So like the gentleman Frank was saying before, before my presentation, you have up to 400 meters, 500 meters type of coverage is what you will get out of that. But there is one more technique wherein I can combine a high band with a mid band, wherein I can move my data channel to the mid band. So this is called dual connectivity, wherein I can move my data channel to the mid band. I can then increase the reach of the high band a little further out. So that's the dual connectivity portion. And then the next stage is wherein I can move the control channels, like your uplink control channels, like your RLC AX, like your channel state information. I can move all that to the midband. And when I do that, then I can increase my coverage even further. So this is where if we combine high band with mid band like CBRS, I can get better reaches. And we have been testing this technology. And I'll talk about some of the results as we progress. Okay, so think of this particular technology as in the inner circle. Yeah, you can get your 28 gig coverage, NR type of coverage, very small coverage up to 500 meters. Then I can do dual connectivity, wherein I can do 28 gig NR, 3.5 gig LTE. So in that scenario, I should be able to get up to 2.5 kilometer line of sight to get to like 1 gigabit type of speeds. And then in the next circle is where I can combine 28 gig NR and 3.5 gig NR. So in this case, this is a carrier aggregation type of scenario wherein I can still get that 1 gigabit type of service. So with 28 gig, I can go up to 5 kilometers to get to that type of speed. So 1 gigabit type of speeds. If I'm talking about 37 gig, I can get up to almost 4 kilometers to be able to get to those gigabit speeds. So then in the outer circle, so you can see this is purely 3.5 gig LTE NR. So in this scenario, you can offer 100 Mbps. So that means the same cell site, which will have 28 gig and 3.5 NR or 3.5 LTE. So you are able to offer those 100 megabit per second service to much farther distances in this outer circle. So in summary, so I should be able to use 37 gig and also 3.5 spectrum to be able to get gigabit speeds up to 4 kilometers line of sight. Okay. Now, I think you might have seen this presented last year, so I won't go over these results, but there are a couple of things I want to talk about. So the multi-user MIMO in terms of sector capacities. So this is a scenario wherein we have 13 users, 10 users were located between from 6 to 8 kilometers from the site. And there were 3 users between 400 meters to 500 meters from the site. And then we were able to get 13 layer MIMO in this scenario. And the throughput, the overall sector capacity that we saw was around 400 Mbps. So on an average, around 400 Mbps. So this is done with LTE. And this was MU MIMO. So you see the system capacity, like if you compare this to a 44R in a single 20 meg channel, you will see around probably 50 to maybe 60 Mbps sector capacity. So, but with 16 layers, this is a type of capacity. Now, do we say that we will get 16 layers all the time? Definitely not. But can we get eight users to be in multi-user MIMO, or maybe 4 users to be in multi-user MIMO? Yes, absolutely. And in those scenarios, if I am able to give 2 layers to a particular user, then I will also get this multiplier effect in capacity. So that's the beauty of multi-user MIMO. Then there is also one other test that we have done, wherein we tested up to 25 kilometer distances, where we can get around 50 Mbps type of throughput at those 25 kilometer distances. So 24.68 to be exact. So with beamforming, as you know, we can reach quite far, focus the energy, get a better signal to noise ratio, and then get your system performance improved. So this is the linker where we can put 28 gig and CBRS together. So how does this compare? So here we have.
So we only have about 10 minutes left, and you have a number of questions, just to let you know.
Sure. Yeah, I have 2 more slides, and we should be done.
Okay.
This is my second last slide. So here we can see that with 3.5 gig, with 3 times 20 meg channels, with 28 gig, combined 400 megahertz of 28 gig. And in this scenario, we have a high powered CPU, which is very, very required for these type of distances. And this is a model with at least 150 feet antenna height. So you are looking at 5 kilometers, 5.5 kilometers type of distance, like I mentioned previously. With 37 gig, this becomes 4 kilometers, where I can get to gigabit speed. So this is with non-line of sight, but around 1.5 kilometer type of distances. So that's the range that you will get out of this carrier aggregation type of technology. Now, in terms of the business case, so when I combine when I combine millimeter wave plus CBRS, the dollar per household passed is around $550 per household passed. 500 homes per square mile is a scenario that we have ran. And in this scenario, we have assumed that we can support 100, 250, 500, and a gigabit type of service. The busy hour throughput that we assumed was pretty high. As you know, in fiber networks, it could be as high as 6, but usually in cable networks, we have observed that to be close to 2.75, 3 Mbps today. So there is a lot of headroom in terms of the system capacity. And we assumed a 33% market share, and the busy hour throughput, of course, grows year over year by at least 28% is this particular model that we have used. So overall, so the combining millimeter wave and also CBRS is definitely a viable and a profitable venture from a business case point of view. Now, I think that concludes my presentation. So definitely there is a strong momentum behind us on the CBRS deployments. There are all these trials that are happening with millimeter wave and also CBRS. Combining those 2 technologies, we are seeing very great results. There have been some announcements in this regard from NBN Australia, whom we partner with, and also UScellular recently, where these type of distances to extend the range of millimeter wave has been tested successfully.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Somi. We have a number of questions that have come in during your talk. Why don't we start off with this? Do fixed wireless access economics make sense at all in a market where there is a cable incumbent with a really strong coverage and penetration in the market?
Yeah, so you have to think through the economics, right? So if I am able to compete wherein I can get to gigabit speeds and make a business case work, and if I have the ability to offer or at least achieve a 33 to 40% market share, yes, definitely you can make that business case work.
So the key is a market share of 30 to 40%, somewhere in that range.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Another question. How successful are the wireless service providers in rolling out fixed wireless access for broadband services so far? Have they been successful? Where has that been done?
Yeah, so they have been very successful. A lot of activity with the wireline operators, as you can see during this year, after CBRS has been GAA from third quarter of last year. So they have been deploying them. There are a lot of WISPs who are deploying CBRS, and we also have rural operators also deploying fixed wireless access using existing spectrum, right? So they have excess capacity in their networks, so they're using that for fixed wireless access.
Great. Okay, this one's for you, Frank, came in. Can you give a sense or a rule of thumb for how different the math is at 37 gigahertz versus, or 49 gigahertz versus 28 gigahertz?
Wow. So, I mean, obviously 49 gigahertz will have a lot more impairments, right? So the distance can be smaller, but how much smaller? I haven't done the math, to be honest with you. I expect it will be just as challenging as 28. I think even though it's a little bit worse, but it's not linear. It's probably not as much in terms of degradation. So I would probably say, look at the 28 and 49 cannot be better. It's going to be a little worse, but probably not too much worse.
So free space path loss is not the dominant term in this equation.
No. I mean, so the model that we used actually was a non-line of sight model. If you use the free space path loss, you can go maybe up to 10, 12 kilometers with the power levels that we have. Yeah.
Right, but clearly that isn't a good sense of reality.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Next question. This is for Somi. This is a great overview of FWA and is critical for cable operators to understand it. In what scenario would you say cable operators should plan to use FWA? When is it better than HFC or fiber for established cable operators?
Yeah, I think the biggest use case you have is really the fiber extension, right? So and you could look at all your cable plans, look at where you have spectrum availability or not even spectrum. I mean, in some rural areas, you can definitely avail that spectrum, right? So we are noticing that with the wireline operators who have deployed in rural areas these days, there is no dearth of spectrum. 60 megahertz is a possibility. So, and they're actually turning it down because CAF only requires 10.1, so they're turning it down. So I think fiber extension is really your biggest use case. And then, of course, you have these programs like RDOF coming up. I mean, I'm definitely sure that the cable companies are thinking about it. And you can offer those 100 Mbps type of services that RDOF requires as well. And in the process, if you're able to avail the government funds to be able to deploy it, I think you can make all these business cases work with fixed wireless access.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions specifically on CBRS and how the range is affected by the power limitations versus C-band, for example, or some of the other spectrum that's available to the rest of the world. Can you speak on that? People are asking, why does CBRS only reach a half a kilometer, not several kilometers at data rate, or what the effective range differentials are, please?
Yeah, I think for fixed wireless access, as I've shown you all the trial results, right? So we can get a good range in the downlink, and if you look at any spectrum like TDD spectrum, it is always uplink challenged. So if you have a product like a massive Mimo product, you have 64 receives, you can do 64 IRC combining, you can get a better uplink. So downlink, even with that very low power, can go quite far. Your limiting factor has always been the uplink. And if you can improve your uplink performance, which is what we can do with our massive Mimo product, hence you can then you can then get a better reach for fixed wireless access.
So what is the reach for, say, a C-band signal versus a CBRS signal? Yeah. What's the difference in distance?
So the C-band versus CBRS, from a downlink perspective, it will not make a big difference, right? So the challenge will always be on the uplink. So on the CBRS side, you have category B devices today, right? So category B means you can go up to 39 dBm ERP on C-band. So if they have high power UEs, then definitely that range can be reached. But remember, uplink is always the problem. Downlink, yeah, with higher power, you can reach a little farther out, but uplink has always been the problem. And if you can solve
Okay, so
that,
for the uplink, what's the effective range limitation if you say that's the difference?
so we have run some link budgets. I do not remember exactly, but if I use roughly the same power, I think I have to go back and check in terms of what we saw, but I don't think it was a big difference.
Okay. Okay, well, I guess we have time for no, it's 4:30. Okay, we have a few more questions. Most of them were surrounding how to get 100 megabit symmetric links and how far you could go using a variety of different technologies. So that's the basic interest. We'll try to get questions at least handed over to you that perhaps you can respond back to on whatever chat site we have. But I want to thank you, Somi, and thank you, Frank. Appreciate your giving these talks, and I hope that was informative for everybody here. And for those of you who did not see this live, can see a recording of this. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks, Morgan.